The moment Maggie Brooks rode into the yard at the Rocking T Ranch on a pale April morning in 1878, every man working the corrals stopped what he was doing and stared, and not a single one of them had the good sense to close his mouth before she noticed. She was 24 years old, and she had been working cattle since she was old enough to hold a rope without falling off her horse. Her father, Chester Brooks, had run a small spread up near Laramie for as long as she could remember, and when a fever took him the previous winter and left her with nothing but a good horse, a worn saddle, and the kind of skill that cannot be bought or learned in any classroom, she had done the only thing she knew how to do. She had gone looking for work. The Rocking T belonged to a man named Harold Tully, who was 63 years old and had been driving cattle to market for longer than most of his hands had been alive. He had advertised for drovers in the Cheyenne newspaper, and Maggie had answered that advertisement the same as any man would, by arriving in person before dawn and presenting herself as ready to work. Harold Tully had looked at her for a long, uncomfortable moment, his sun-browned face giving nothing away, and then he had said, "You understand this is a drive to Abilene, roughly 6 weeks on the trail. No accommodations for ladies." "I am not looking for accommodations," Maggie had told him plainly. "I am looking for a job." Tully had hired her on the spot. He was old enough and wise enough to recognize talent when it stood in front of him, and he had watched her spend 20 minutes working a difficult young steer back into the corral before the conversation was even finished. After that, the matter of her being a woman seemed considerably less important than the matter of her being useful. That had been yesterday. Today was the day the drive officially assembled, and that was the morning that Maggie Brooks and Frank Bancroft first laid eyes on each other. Frank was 30 years old, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that had been set against the wind for too many seasons, and eyes the color of new sage after rain, somewhere between gray and green depending on the light. He was Tully's trail boss, had been for 3 years running, and he had heard about the woman Tully had hired the same way everyone else on the outfit had heard, through the particular brand of whispered astonishment that travels faster through a bunkhouse than any telegram. He had formed an opinion before he even saw her, and the opinion was not generous. Not because he was a man who thought poorly of women in general, but because he was a trail boss, and trail bosses were in the business of managing problems before they became disasters, and the addition of one woman to 14 cowboys was the sort of problem that had disaster written all over it in his considerable experience. He was standing beside the remuda, checking over the string of horses that had been assigned to the drive, when she rode in on a big roan mare that moved with the careful, athletic grace of a horse that had been well-trained and well-kept. Maggie sat the horse the way people sit things they have been sitting their whole lives, completely without self-consciousness, her long dark braid tucked under a battered hat, her riding gloves already on. Frank watched her dismount in one clean motion, tie her horse to the rail, and immediately begin checking the cinch on her saddle with the focused attention of someone who trusted no one else's work but their own. He watched her run a hand down each of the mare's front legs, checking for heat or swelling, the way any experienced drover would do before a long day's work. He watched all of this, and he felt the certainty of his prepared opinion begin, very slightly, to waver. "You must be Brooks," he said, walking toward her. She straightened and looked at him directly, which was the first thing about her that surprised him because many people, men included, tended to look somewhere around his collar when they talked to him. She had brown eyes the color of good saddle leather, clear and entirely unimpressed. "I am," she said, "and you must be Bancroft. Mr. Tully mentioned you." "Did he?" "He said you were the best trail boss he had ever hired and that you had the personality of a thunderstorm." There was a pause. Then Frank said, "He says that to everyone." He seemed to think it was a compliment. Frank looked at her for another moment and then he said, "I need to be straight with you before this drive gets moving. I run a tight outfit. I don't make special allowances for anyone, and that includes you. You fall behind, you create problems, you can't hold your position, I'll send you back." "That is perfectly fair," Maggie said, without any particular heat in her voice. "I would expect nothing less." "All right then," Frank said, and that was the entirety of their first conversation. The drive assembled itself across the rest of that morning, the way drives always did, in a controlled kind of chaos that slowly resolved into order. There were 1,500 head of longhorn cattle, 14 cowboys including Maggie, a cook named Amos Dupree who had been feeding cowboys on the trail for 20 years and had opinions about everything, and a horse wrangler named Tamaz Reyes who was 17 years old and deeply in awe of absolutely everything he encountered. The Longhorns were ornery from the start, as Longhorns tended to be. They were Texas cattle, bought by Tully at a price that reflected both their number and their considerable bad temper, and they had been penned up for several days waiting for the drive to begin, which had done nothing to improve their dispositions. When the gates opened and the herd started moving north and east toward the trail that would eventually carry them all the way to the Kansas railheads, the first hour was a controlled disaster of bawling, stampeding, and general bovine rebellion. Maggie was riding the right flank, which was one of the harder positions on a drive because it required constant pressure to keep the herd moving in the right direction, without pushing them so hard that the cattle on that side got nervous and infected the whole herd with their nervousness. Frank had put her there deliberately, because it was the position most likely to expose any weakness in a drover's skill, and because he was still a man who needed to see for himself rather than take someone else's word for things. What he saw, over the course of that first long afternoon, was that Maggie Brooks did not have weaknesses, not the kind he had been watching for. She read the cattle the way she had been reading them her whole life, anticipating the shifts and surges before they became problems, pressing her mare into position with a light, sure hand, using her rope with an economy of motion that spoke of deep practice. When a group of steers on her flank tried to break right and head for a draw that led away from the trail, she was in front of them before they had gone 20 feet, turning them back without drama, without wasted effort. Frank watched all of this from the position he normally rode at the head of the herd, and he felt his prepared opinion continue its long, slow dismantling. The first camp that night was on the banks of a creek that had no name on any map Frank had ever consulted. Amos Dupree had the fire going and coffee ready before the last of the cattle were settled, which was the singular most valuable skill a drive cook could possess. The cowboys came in from their positions in ones and twos, tired in that good, bone-deep way that comes from a hard day's productive work, and they gathered around the fire in the particular quiet way that the first evening on a long drive tends to produce, when everyone is beginning to understand the real scale of what they have committed to. Maggie took care of her mare before she came anywhere near the fire, unsaddling her and checking her over and making sure she had water, which took a while because the mare had worked hard and deserved the attention. By the time she settled herself on the far edge of the firelight with a plate of Amos's beans and a cup of his legendarily strong coffee, most of the other men were already eating. There was a silence that was not entirely comfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms in the presence of something unfamiliar, something that does not fit the established pattern of things. The cowboys of the Rocking T Drive were not, by and large, bad men. They were working men, most of them in their 20s, with the ordinary collection of virtues and small failures that working men everywhere possess. But they did not know how to behave around Maggie Brooks, and so they defaulted to not behaving in any particular way, which produced the silence. A man named Pete Garfield, who was 26 and had a broad, honest face that showed every thought he had with complete transparency, was the one who broke it. "That was good work today on the right flank," he said to Maggie, without any apparent ulterior motive, just the plain acknowledgement of a fellow professional. "Those steers that tried for the draw would have taken half the herd with them if they'd gotten through. They were looking for it all afternoon," Maggie said. That big brindle one in particular. He is going to be trouble for the whole drive. This was the sort of observation that cowboys respected unconditionally, because it was the kind of observation that could only come from someone who had been paying close attention. Several of the other men around the fire began to listen more actively, and what had been a silence full of uncertainty began to slowly become something else. Frank sat outside the circle of firelight for a while after he had finished eating, drinking his coffee and watching the herd settle, and watching his crew settle, and watching Maggie Brooks talk about cattle with Pete Garfield and a quiet, competent man named Davis Cole who had ridden drives with Frank for 2 seasons. And he thought about the nature of first impressions and how often they were wrong. He did not speak to her again that evening. But when he checked the watch rotation before he turned in, he put her on the second watch, which was the most demanding one, and he did it without any sense that he was testing her anymore. He did it because she was one of his best hands, and the second watch needed his best hands. The second day of the drive brought the first real crisis, and it happened the way real crises always happened, without warning and from an unexpected direction. They were moving through a stretch of open grassland when a late-season lightning storm came rolling in from the northwest, the kind of fast-moving storm that the Wyoming and Kansas country was famous for, that went from a dark line on the horizon to overhead in the time it took to blink. The thunder hit before the rain did, a series of sharp, close cracks that sounded like the earth itself breaking open, and the herd reacted the way 1,500 frightened longhorns react to the sound of the earth breaking open. They ran. A full cattle stampede is one of the genuinely terrifying spectacles available in the natural world. 1,500 animals, each weighing somewhere between 800 and 1,100 pounds, moving at speed in an approximately unified direction, produce a sound and a tremor in the ground that is impossible to adequately describe to someone who has never experienced it. The dust rises in a wall. The noise becomes a physical presence. And the cowboys who are responsible for those animals have perhaps 2 minutes to get in front of them before the herd scatters in a way that will take days to fully recover from. Frank was in front within seconds, his big gray horse already moving before he had even made a conscious decision to move it, because this was the kind of work that lived in the body rather than the mind after enough years at it. He could hear other riders behind him, pressing hard, trying to reach the front of the herd and turn it in on itself, which was the only way to stop a run of this kind. What he did not expect was that the rider who reached the lead animals first, ahead of every other drover on the outfit, was Maggie Brooks. Her roan mare was fast, genuinely fast in the way that some horses are simply faster than others, and Maggie had positioned herself on the right side of the herd where the leaders were showing the most speed. She came up alongside the lead animals and she rode them hard, pressing her mare into the edge of the herd, forcing the leaders to veer left, and then she stayed with them, staying in their field of vision, keeping the pressure on, her hat long gone in the wind, her dark braid flying loose, riding with the complete, focused fearlessness of someone who had been in exactly this situation before and knew exactly what to do in it. The herd began to curve. Gradually, then faster, the great mass of cattle turning in on itself, the run losing its dangerous linear energy and transforming into a wide, tightening circle, the animals at the back piling into the animals in front until the whole motion slowed and stopped in a great heaving, bawling, blowing mass. Frank rode up beside Maggie in the aftermath, both of them breathing hard, their horses dancing with spent adrenaline. Maggie's shirt was soaked through with rain that had started somewhere in the middle of the run, and her hair was completely down around her shoulders, and she was checking her mare's breathing with her hand flat against the horse's neck. "Good riding," Frank said. It was not enough. It was nowhere near enough. But he was not yet a man who knew how to say the things that were actually adequate to the moment. Maggie looked at him sideways, her brown eyes bright. "She is a good horse," she said. "It wasn't the horse," Frank said. She held his gaze for a moment, and something shifted in the air between them, something small and tentative and entirely new. Then she looked away at the calming herd and said, "We should get them moving again before they have time to think about it." "Yes," Frank agreed, and they rode back to their positions. That night around the fire, the mood was different. A surviving crisis together does something to a group of people, strips away certain pretenses and formal distances, and replaces them with a different kind of bond. The cowboys of the Rocking T Drive had faced a bad stampede, and they had gotten the herd back together with the loss of only 11 animals, which by any measure was a remarkable outcome, and they knew it. Davis Cole, who was a man of few words and careful ones, said to the fire at large, "That was some riding today." He said it in the direction of Maggie. "It was," said Pete Garfield, nodding. A third man, Hector Vega, who was Maggie's age and had been among the most uncertain about her presence on the drive, said nothing, but held up his coffee cup in her direction, which from Hector was approximately equivalent to a formal speech. Maggie accepted all of this with a nod and went back to her coffee, and if there was a warmth in her face that was not entirely from the fire, it was subtle enough that only someone paying close attention would have noticed it. Frank was paying close attention. He was sitting across the fire from her, which meant he could see her face clearly in the light, and he was thinking thoughts that he had not made any prior arrangement to think. He was thinking that her face in firelight was a remarkable thing, all warm shadow and clear strong lines, and that the way she laughed at something Pete Garfield said was the most uncomplicated sound he had heard in a long time. He was thinking these things, and simultaneously thinking that he was a trail boss, and she was a drover on his drive, and that nothing about this situation was remotely appropriate for the kind of thoughts he was having. He went to bed that night in a state of considerable internal frustration with himself. The third and fourth days were hard traveling days, long miles across country that offered alternating stretches of good grass and bad river crossings that required careful management of the herd, and the constant low-grade attrition of heat and dust and physical exhaustion. The cowboys worked their positions with the steady, unsentimental focus of professionals, and the drive settled into its own rhythm, a rhythm that all long drives eventually find, a moving world with its own geography and social order. In this moving world, Maggie occupied a position that was unusual in ways that went beyond the obvious. She was not simply a woman among men. She was a drover among drovers, and at the same time something slightly apart, and she navigated this with a combination of easy competence and careful dignity that most of the men on the drive had come to respect, if not always comfortably. The man who was not comfortable was a drover named Kurt Howell. He was 28, had a thin, clever face and a tongue that he used frequently and without a great deal of restraint. And from the first day he had made it clear, in small ways rather than direct confrontation, that he considered Maggie's presence on the drive an offense against the proper order of things. He made comments that were just barely oblique enough to be arguable, positioned himself in ways that created small inconveniences for her, and generally conducted himself as a man who has decided to win an argument through accumulation rather than confrontation. Maggie had, for 4 days, ignored him with the focused thoroughness with which she did everything. On the 5th morning, the matter came to a head in a way that nobody had arranged, but that perhaps everybody had been expecting. They were at a river crossing, the Platte running broad and shallow but with a deceptive current, and the herd was balking at the water the way cattle always balked, with the unreasonable determination of animals that have no understanding of the concept of schedule. The drovers were positioned around the herd, pushing, pressing, coaxing, doing the 1,000 small urgent things that go into moving 1,500 reluctant animals into a river. Kurt Howell, from his position on the left flank, called across the water to nobody in particular and everybody in specific. Maybe Tully should have hired somebody who actually knows how to handle a river crossing instead of somebody who makes the pretty scenery. The words carried. They were meant to carry. Maggie did not respond. She was busy with something more important than Kurt Howell, which was getting the lead animals into the water. She had identified the 2 or 3 animals in the front of the herd who were the most likely to go if they were pushed right, and she was pushing them right, pressing her mare in close enough that the lead steer had nowhere to put himself but forward. He went. The animals behind him went, and the crossing began. Frank had heard Howell's comment. He had heard it and felt it land somewhere inside his chest like a hot coal, and he had noted it and set it aside for later because right now there was a river crossing to manage. When the last animal was across, and the cowboys were shaking the water out of their hats, and Amos was threatening everyone with the consequences of getting river mud in his supply wagon, Frank rode his gray horse up beside Kurt Howell. "Howell," he said quietly, which in Frank Bancroft's voice was actually more concerning than loud. Howell looked at him with the face of a man who knows something is coming. "What you said at the crossing," Frank said. "Don't say things like that again." "I was just making an observation," Howell said. "Your observation got the crossing started," Frank said. "Which means you observed wrong. And more than that, she is a member of this outfit and she works as hard as any man on it, and I will not have talked like that on my drive. Is that clear?" Howell said yes. It was clear, in the tone of a man who has decided that this particular hill is not worth dying on. Frank rode away, and he did not look at Maggie as he passed her, but he was aware, with a kind of peripheral certainty, that she had heard the exchange. She caught up with him half an hour later just briefly, riding close enough to speak without being overheard by anyone else on the outfit. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," Frank said. "That kind of talk poisons an outfit. I've seen it before. Most trail bosses would have let it go." "I'm not most trail bosses," he said, and he said it simply without any particular ego behind it, just as a statement of fact. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No. You are not." She rode back to her position, and Frank stared at the horizon ahead of them for a long time after that, thinking about the way she had said it, not as a compliment given to smooth things over. As a genuine observation, offered with the same honest attention she gave to everything. He was, he realized, in a significant amount of trouble. The drive crossed into Nebraska on the 8th day, and the country changed, opening up into the long, rolling grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction with the kind of absolute flatness that either broke people or freed them, depending on who they were. The sky above the plains was enormous, a presence in itself, full of weather and movement, and the herd moved through it like a slow brown river finding its channel. They stopped for nooning near a cluster of cottonwoods beside a thin creek, and while the cattle rested and Amos made something he described as stew and everyone else described with less charitable words, Maggie walked down to the creek to wash the dust out of her hair. She did not expect company, and she did not get exactly company, but when she came back through the cottonwoods with her hair loose and damp and her hat in her hand, she nearly walked directly into Frank, who was coming the other way. They both stopped. There was a moment of the particular kind of awkwardness that comes from encountering someone you have been thinking about in a context that is stripped of the usual professional distance. "I was looking for a better crossing point for tomorrow," Frank said, which was technically true in that tomorrow they would need to cross the creek, but the creek was 8 inches deep and presented roughly 0 logistical challenges. "It's not very deep," Maggie observed. "No," Frank agreed. They walked back toward the camp together without any particular decision to do so, just the natural momentum of 2 people going in the same direction. The cottonwoods dappled the afternoon light across the ground, and somewhere in the branches above them, a meadowlark was being very vocal about the beauty of the day, and the whole moment had a quality to it that Frank recognized and distrusted in himself. "Where are you from?" he asked, because silence between them was suddenly something he was not interested in. "Laramie," she said. "Before that, eastern Colorado. My father kept moving." "What kind of man was he?" "A good one," she said, and her voice had a texture in it that told him plainly that the subject was both important and recent. "He died in January. Fever." "I'm sorry," Frank said, and he meant it with a plainness that matched hers. "He taught me everything I know about cattle," she said. "He used to say that cattle are simple animals who only want grass and water and the company of other cattle, and that the trick to working with them was to want the same things in sufficient quantity." Frank smiled, which was something his face did less often than it should have. It changed his face completely, took away the weathered gravity of it and replaced it with something younger and considerably more appealing. "He sounds like he had a good philosophy." "He did," Maggie said. She glanced at him sideways, and there was something considering in her look, something that weighed him the way she weighed everything. "What about you? Where are you from?" "Missouri," he said. "A small place. My father farmed." "But you didn't want to farm." "I wanted to be where the sky was bigger," he said, and then immediately felt slightly ridiculous about having said it because it sounded like the kind of thing a romantic fool said rather than a trail boss. But Maggie nodded as though it made perfect sense, which perhaps it did. "I understand that," she said. They reached the edge of the camp, and Amos handed them each a cup of something that was coffee adjacent, and they stood together for a moment in the way that two people stand when neither of them is ready to move away. Then Pete Garfield called out that the herd was getting restless, and Frank put on his professional face and went to deal with it, and the moment closed. But it left a residue. The evenings on the drive had their own particular character, shaped by exhaustion and distance from anything else. And as the nights accumulated, they became increasingly important as the only space in the relentless working day where something other than work could exist. The drovers played cards and told stories and argued about inconsequential things with the energy of people who need the release that argument provides, and Maggie was part of all of this now, in a way that felt natural rather than arranged. She played cards sharply. This was discovered on the 9th evening when Pete Garfield suggested a modest game of poker, and everyone contributed a few coins to the pot, and Maggie cleaned everyone out within an hour with the serene efficiency of someone who had been playing since childhood. "You did not mention you could play poker," Pete said, in the tone of a man reviewing decisions he now regretted. "You did not ask," Maggie said, stacking her coins. Hector Vega made a sound that might have been laughter, which was remarkable because Hector rarely made sounds that could be identified as any emotion in particular. Davis Cole said that he had been hustled, which was the finest compliment a card player could receive from Davis Cole because it implied a certain level of professional respect. Frank had not played, but he had watched from his customary position at the edge of things, and the laughter in his chest at the expression on Pete Garfield's face was something he had not felt in a long time. When Maggie caught his eye across the fire, still stacking her coins with that composed expression, and something flickered in her eyes that might have been humor directed specifically at him, he felt it somewhere considerably deeper than his chest. He looked away first. The trouble with Kurt Howell had not ended with Frank's quiet warning at the river. Howell was a stubborn man, which was perhaps his only consistent quality, and he had spent the days since that conversation conducting himself in compliance with the letter of what Frank had told him, while doing very little about the spirit of it. He was civil to Maggie in a way that managed to convey contempt without providing any specific grounds for objection, and he watched her with a quality of attention that Maggie recognized without being able to definitively name. On the 12th day, he did something that crossed a line he could not argue his way back from. They were pushing hard to make a water source before evening, and the cattle were tired and hot, and therefore more difficult than usual. Maggie was on the right flank again, holding her position with the steady diligence that had become her hallmark, when Howell, who was riding swing behind her, failed to hold his position on a group of straying animals and let them drift wide to the right. This was either a mistake or it was deliberate. In the dust and noise of a long afternoon, it was genuinely difficult to tell. What was not difficult to tell was that the straying animals hit Maggie's flank from the inside, pushing her section of the herd into a bulge that cost her 20 minutes and considerable effort to resolve, and that during those 20 minutes Howell was simply absent, his position empty, which meant that the problem compounded itself. Frank saw it. Davis Cole saw it. Pete Garfield, who was riding point, heard about it from Davis Cole within the hour. That evening Frank spoke to Howell again, and this time the conversation was considerably shorter, because Frank had reached the point where brevity was the only option remaining. "You're riding drag tomorrow," he said. Drag was the worst position on a drive, at the back of the herd, breathing the dust of 1,500 animals for a full day. It was where drovers who needed to think about their choices were sent. And if there is another incident, you'll be riding back to the rocking T with your wages to that point, and a letter from me that will make it difficult for you to find work on any outfit I've ever talked to, which is most of them in Wyoming and Kansas. Howell went a drag the next day and said nothing more about Maggie Brooks for the remainder of the drive. He was not converted, he was contained, but contained was sufficient. What Frank did not see, because he had conducted both conversations privately, was Maggie's face when she realized what had happened. She had been aware of the situation with her flank, and she had dealt with it, and she had made her own private accounting of what Howell had done. She was not a woman who needed rescuing, and she was not a woman who would ever mistake being managed for being valued. But when Davis Cole told her in his sparse way that Howell had been moved to drag and why, she sat with that information for a while and felt something that was complicated. She had worked around men her whole life, and most of them fell into one of two categories. There were the ones who dismissed her, who saw only the fact of her being a woman and derived everything they believed about her from that single fact. And there were the ones who pretended the fact did not exist, who were careful in ways that were their own kind of condescension, a pretense of equality that was really just a different shape of the same underlying assumption. Frank Bancroft was neither of these things. He treated her exactly as he treated every other drover on the outfit, with the same level of expectation and the same level of accountability. And when he defended her, it was not because she was a woman who needed defending, but because she was a member of his outfit and a professional being treated unprofessionally. That was a distinction that mattered enormously, and she understood it clearly enough to feel its full weight. That evening she sat down beside him, which she had not done before, choosing instead to keep the particular distance that seemed appropriate between a drover and a trail boss. She sat down beside him at the edge of the fire, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching in the way that two people sit when the space is limited, and she said, "Thank you for what you did about Howell." Frank looked at the fire. "It was an outfit matter." "It was," Maggie agreed, "and you handled it as one. That's why I'm thanking you." He turned to look at her then, because there was something in her voice that required looking at, and their faces were closer than they had been before, close enough that the firelight was doing very specific things to the planes of her face that his attention could not walk away from. "You're a good hand, Maggie," he said, and he said her name for the first time, not Brooks as he had been saying all along, but Maggie, and she heard the difference. "You're a good trail boss, Frank," she said, also the first time. They sat by the fire for a long while after the other men had turned in, talking about things that were neither work nor the drive. They talked about the country, about the particular quality of the light over the plains, about what they had each wanted when they were young, and whether they had found it. Frank told her about his first drive, when he was 22, and the trail boss had been a man named McAllister who could read whether the way other people read print, and about how he had determined on that drive that this was the work he was going to do for the rest of his life. Maggie told him about her father taking her out on her first roundup when she was 11, sitting her on the quietest horse in the string, and telling her to just watch, and how watching had been its own kind of instruction. Amos Dupree, who was the earliest riser on the drive, and therefore saw most of what happened in the hours before dawn, noted when he came to start the morning fire that Frank and Maggie had talked well past midnight, and that the embers of the previous night's fire had been stirred as recently as 2 hours before. He noted this with the particular satisfaction of a man who has survived enough hard seasons to appreciate what it looks like when something good is beginning, and he made the coffee especially strong that morning as a kind of private celebration. The drive was halfway to Abilene. 3 weeks behind them, 3 weeks ahead, and the nature of those ahead weeks had been quietly rearranged by the weeks already past. The 14th day brought a different kind of trouble, the kind that came from outside the outfit rather than within it. They were moving through a stretch of country near the Kansas border when they encountered a group of 4 men on horseback who positioned themselves across the trail with the casual confidence of people who believed they held an advantage. The leader was a man named Desmond Prout, who Frank had heard of through the network of information that trail bosses maintained about hazards on the various routes to the railheads. Prout ran what he called a toll operation, and what was actually a theft operation, targeting drives that were too small or too underarmed to effectively resist, demanding payment in cattle for the right to pass through country that he had no legal claim to. He had been doing this for 3 years and had never been successfully prosecuted, partly because the county government was far away and understaffed, and partly because the men he targeted were generally transient, their testimony difficult to gather and present. Frank rode forward to meet him, and the conversation was brief and unpleasant. Prout wanted 40 head of cattle. Frank told him calmly and without particular drama that he was not going to receive 40 head of cattle. Prout gestured toward his 3 companions, all of whom had their hands resting on their rifles, and said that this seemed like a negotiating position that didn't account for the full situation. Frank said, "Look behind me." Prout looked. Behind Frank, in a loose line extending across the trail, were 14 drovers. 12 of them were men, and 2 of them were Maggie Brooks, and every single one of them was watching the exchange with the particular attention of people who have spent 3 weeks working very hard and are not inclined to let someone else take the benefit of that work. Several of them had their own rifles across their saddles, not aimed but present. Prout's arithmetic changed. "We will not be paying any toll," Frank said, "and you will move your men off this trail, and that will be the end of this conversation." Prout and his men moved. They moved with a certain amount of sullen dignity that preserved the form of their choice without changing the outcome. Prout said something as he passed that was probably meant to be threatening and came across as an apology for having miscalculated, and then he and his men rode south and the drive went north, and that was that. Back in the line, Pete Garfield exhaled loudly. "Was wondering how that was going to go," he said. "It was always going to go that way," Davis Cole said. "How do you figure that?" "Because Bancroft figured it that way," Davis said simply. Maggie had watched the whole exchange from her position in the line, and what she had watched most carefully was Frank, the absolute steadiness of him, the way he had not moved a single unnecessary muscle during the whole confrontation, the way his voice had carried across the distance with a quality that was entirely different from loudness, something denser and more permanent than volume. She had known men who were brave in the explosive, unconsidered way that courage sometimes takes in young men, and she had known men who were careful in the calculating way that caution sometimes masquerades as wisdom. She had not often known a man who was both steady and fearless at the same time, the way those qualities sat in Frank Bancroft like 2 elements of the same material. She thought about this for the rest of that afternoon as she rode her position, and the thought had a certain warmth to it. The evenings had become something both of them moved toward. It was not discussed or arranged. It simply happened that after supper and the settling of the herd and the watch rotation was established, Frank and Maggie ended up in proximity, usually at the edge of the camp, looking out at whatever the landscape of the day had deposited around them. Some evenings they talked for hours, and some evenings they were simply companionably quiet together, which was its own kind of closeness. Frank was not, by nature, a man who talked freely. He had spent years developing the conversational economy that a trail boss required, the ability to say precisely what was needed and nothing more, and he had perhaps let this economy infiltrate his personal life more than was healthy. But around Maggie it relaxed. He found himself saying things he had not planned to say, following the thread of a thought further than he normally would, and discovering at the end of those threads that she was still with him, still listening with that particular quality of attention she gave to everything worth giving attention to. On the 16th evening, he told her about the woman he had been engaged to 5 years ago. Her name had been Clara, and she had been from a good family in Kansas City, and they had been engaged for 8 months before Clara had made it clear that she had believed, and continued to believe, that Frank would eventually settle, that the drives were a phase and not a vocation, and that she had not signed on to be the wife of a man who was gone for 6 weeks out of every 8 and smelled of cattle dust for the rest of them. She wasn't wrong, Frank said, about what I was. I didn't know how to do anything else. Was that what you wanted, to settle? I thought I should want it, he said. That's different. Maggie was quiet for a moment. My father used to say that the sorriest thing a person could do was spend their life wanting something they thought they should want instead of wanting the thing they actually wanted. Smart man, Frank said. He was. She paused, looking out at the dark, flat country. I tried it once myself, tried to be what everyone expected, tried to stay in town, help someone else's wife with her household, be what a woman was supposed to be. She stopped. What happened? Frank asked. I was terrible at it, she said, and the corner of her mouth went up. I kept trying to fix the fence posts. Frank laughed, a real one, full and unguarded, and it was perhaps the finest sound she had ever heard, partly because she had been responsible for it. They looked at each other in the near dark, and the distance between them was not very much at all, and Frank felt the whole situation with a lucidity that was both very pleasant and very complicated. He was her trail boss. She was his drover. There were 3 weeks left on this drive. These were the facts that he held up against the other facts. The facts of her voice in the dark and her profile against the stars, and the way she laughed, and the way she rode, and the way she was, completely and entirely herself. He did not say anything further that evening that was not appropriate for a trail boss to say to a drover, but the space between those constraints and what he wanted to say had become very small. On the 18th day, the event happened that everyone on the Rocking T Drive remembered afterward as the moment when everything became clear. Not to Maggie and Frank, who had their own internal versions of events, but to every other soul on the drive, who had been watching the situation develop with the complete and unguarded attention of people who have nothing else to watch and find it entirely compelling. The brindle steer that Maggie had identified on the first day as a troublemaker had been living up to his billing all drive long, requiring extra attention, creating friction in the herd, generally being the animal that every drive has, the one bad apple whose influence never quite spoils everything but never quite goes away either. On the 18th day, he found his opportunity, and he took it with the conviction of an animal who has been waiting for exactly this moment. They were pushing toward a watering hole at midday, the cattle urgent and fast-moving with the smell of water ahead of them, when the brindle broke. He went left, away from the main herd, with a speed and determination that took everyone off guard, and he took 40 animals with him before anyone had time to respond. 40 animals was a meaningful number. 40 animals, if they scattered in the broken country to the west of the trail, could cost a day and a half of recovery time and the loss of some animals permanently, which Harold Tully would note on the final accounting with the unhappy precision of a man who is paying for the cattle himself. Maggie was already moving before the break fully materialized. It was as though she had been waiting for it, or rather had never stopped expecting it, had kept some part of her attention fixed on that brindle animal for 18 days because she had read him correctly on the first day and had not stopped reading him since. She went after him at a run, her roan mare extending flat across the ground, and the other cowboys scrambled to follow, but she was faster and she was first. What followed was 20 minutes of riding that could not be adequately described to anyone who was not there to watch it. It was Maggie and her mare working in the broken, rocky ground to the west of the trail, pursuing not just the brindle but all 40 animals, using the geography of the land itself, pressing through gaps and around outcroppings, anticipating where the animals would go before they went there, turning the brindle back again and again, each time he tried to take his followers in a new direction. She rode without hesitation through places that required her to trust her horse completely, and the mare gave her that trust back, and together they worked. The other drovers arrived and took positions that Maggie indicated with gestures and shouts, and eventually, in the exhausted, cooperative way that this kind of thing always ended, the 40 animals were turned and headed back toward the main herd, with the brindle at their center, outmaneuvered at last. When it was done, everyone came together in the dusty aftermath, and Maggie was at the center of it, her mare blowing hard, both of them streaked with exertion. Pete Garfield was saying something enthusiastic and largely incoherent. Hector Vega had an expression on his face that was unambiguously one of admiration. Davis Cole had his hat in his hand, which was his version of a standing ovation. And Frank Bancroft, the trail boss, the man who had run this kind of drive for 8 years and had seen drovers do remarkable things in difficult conditions, and had always acknowledged skill with the careful, measured language of a man who must maintain authority by not appearing to play favorites, looked at Maggie Brooks in front of his entire assembled crew and said, in a voice that carried clearly to every single man present, "That is the best hand on this drive. Right there." And I'll argue that with any man who says different. The silence that followed was about 2 seconds long, then the cheering started. It was not a polished, organized response. It was the genuine, unrehearsed eruption of a group of tired, honest working men who had watched something exceptional and were being given permission to say so. Pete Garfield whooped. Hector Vega clapped with a violence that seemed designed to make up for his entire previous reserve. Davis Cole put his hat back on and then took it off again. Even Kurt Howell, back there in his drag position, dusty and humbled, said something that sounded like agreement and meant it. Maggie heard all of it, and she felt all of it, but she was looking at Frank, and Frank was looking at her. And everything that was said in that look had been building for 18 days and was now simply present in the air between them, undeniable. She did not say anything in that moment. Neither did he. But that night, when the camp was settled and the watch was set and the stars were doing their work over the Kansas plains, she came and sat beside him at the fire. And this time she sat close, not with the careful professional distance she had maintained, but close, and their shoulders actually touched, and neither of them moved away. "You didn't have to say it in front of everyone," she said. "Yes, I did," Frank said. "Why?" He turned to look at her, and in the firelight his face had the look of a man who has decided that the comfortable middle ground is no longer available to him and is finding that this is something he is all right with. "Because it was true," he said, "and because things that are true deserve to be said where people can hear them." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "Frank," she said. "Maggie," he said. "I am not going to spend another 2 weeks wondering what this is," she said, because she was a woman who had decided some time ago that directness was the only honest approach to important things. "Neither am I," he said. And there on the Kansas plains, 21 days out of the rocking T and 21 days from Abilene, with 1,500 cattle sleeping in the dark around them and the Big Dipper turning overhead and Amos Dupree pretending to sleep 15 feet away, while actually being very awake indeed. Frank Bancroft took Maggie Brooks's hand in both of his own and held it with a careful, deliberate tenderness that said everything a man needs to say when words are insufficient to the occasion. They sat together until the second watch came on, and when Maggie finally went to her bedroll, she carried something warm and certain inside her that had not been there before, and it was not the fire. The last 3 weeks of the drive had a different quality, and everyone felt it, though nobody said so directly, because saying so directly would have been unseemly and also unnecessary. What had been something unspoken was now something unspoken in a different register, a warmth rather than a tension, a presence rather than an absence, and the outfit as a whole seemed to breathe slightly more easily because of it. Frank and Maggie were careful about the line between their personal and professional lives, because Frank was still the trail boss and she was still a drover, and the integrity of the outfit required that those roles remain clear. During the working hours, he was Bancroft and she was Brooks, and he held her to the same standard he held everyone, and she met it and sometimes exceeded it, and nothing in the work itself changed. It was only in the margins of the days, in the evenings and the hour before dawn when the camp was waking but not yet working, that the other thing was allowed to exist, but it existed fully in those margins. They talked and talked and talked, the way two people talk who have discovered that the other person is someone they can talk to without performing, without selecting, without the particular exhaustion of presenting a managed version of themselves. Frank told her things about himself he had not told other people, not because he was secretive by choice, but because there had never been anyone who seemed sufficiently interested in the actual content of his interior life, rather than the external facts of his professional one. Maggie told him things about her life on her father's ranch, about the loneliness of that winter after Chester Brooks died, and she had realized that the only thing she had was the skills he had given her and the determination to use them. She told him about the men who had offered marriage as a solution to that loneliness, who had seen a competent, capable woman recently bereaved and had presented themselves as shelter, as though being capable of providing material security was the same thing as being someone a person might actually want to be with. Were any of them difficult to refuse? Frank asked. Maggie considered this with her characteristic honesty. No, she said. They were offering something I didn't want. It's not difficult to refuse what you don't want. What do you want? He asked. It was a question he had no right to ask in any professional context, but they were well past professional context by this point, sitting in the dark with the fire reduced to embers and the cattle quiet around them. She looked at him for a long moment. This, she said. I want this. Work that matters and a sky big enough to think in and someone worth talking to at the end of the day. That's a good answer, he said. What about you? She asked. He thought about it carefully because Frank Bancroft did not say things without thinking about them. The same, he said. With some additions. Such as the same person worth talking to at the end of every day, he said. Not just a drive's worth of days. The look they exchanged after that was one that required no additional words, which was convenient because neither of them had any. On the 28th day, something happened that was neither dramatic nor difficult, but that meant a great deal to Maggie in ways she had not expected. They stopped at a small settlement at the edge of a farming community, just a dozen buildings and a dry goods store, to resupply the outfit's provisions. The settlement had a small collection of permanent residents who came out to watch the drive pass with the interest that a long cattle drive always generated among people who did not regularly see one. Among these residents was a woman, perhaps 50 years old, with the look of someone who had made a hard life work through sheer determination, and she watched Maggie ride past with an expression that Maggie could not immediately read. Then the woman called out, not unkindly, "Good Lord, is that a woman riding with that outfit?" Several of the other residents looked. A few of the cowboys grinned. Frank, riding beside Maggie in one of those moments when their positions had naturally brought them adjacent, said without changing his expression or raising his voice by much, "Best hand I've got." The woman at the edge of the road looked at Frank, and then back at Maggie, and then she smiled with a completeness that did not require any further interpretation, and she said, "Good." It was a very small moment, and it passed quickly, and the drive moved on. But Maggie carried that good with her for the rest of the day, And when she thought about it, she thought about the woman who had said it, and all the things that had probably been contained in those words. A whole compressed accounting of what it meant to be a woman capable of something that other people had always assumed she was not capable of, and the particular gift of being recognized for it by someone who understood the full weight of that recognition. She looked over at Frank later that afternoon, finding him where he usually was, at the point of the herd where the trail unrolled ahead of them, and she thought that whatever came next, this drive, this summer, this man, she had been right to come. The cattle drive reached the outskirts of Abilene on a warm morning in late May, the city announcing itself first as a smell, then as a sound, then as a smudge on the horizon that gradually resolved into the water towers and rooftops and general agitation of a major Kansas railhead at full operation. Abilene in 1878 was a different city than it had been at the height of the cattle trade boom years earlier, somewhat tamer, the notorious days of its wildest period already becoming something people talked about in the past tense. But it was still very much a cattle town, with the stockyards and the buyers and the long-established infrastructure of an industry that moved millions of dollars worth of beef through its facilities every season. Harold Tully was there to meet them, having come ahead by rail, and he watched his herd come in with the expression of a man counting the return on a significant investment. He walked the herd with Frank while the cattle were being sorted and counted, and his expression moved gradually from calculating to satisfied, which was the best possible direction for that movement to go. "Good drive?" Tully asked. "Good drive," Frank confirmed. "I heard about the stampede and the fruit business. Word travels. Always does." Tully paused, watching a section of the herd move through the stockyard gates. "I heard about Brooks on the right flank during that run." "You'll hear more before you're done," Frank said. Tully looked at him with the quiet, accumulated perception of a man who has been reading people for 63 years. "Will I?" he said. "You hired the best hand on this drive," Frank said. "She should know that her position on any future drives you run is solid if she wants it." Tully looked at him for a moment longer, and then he said, "Done. I'll tell her myself." The payout happened the following morning, in the offices of the cattle buyer, and every drover received their wages for 6 weeks on the trail, which was not a fortune by any objective measure, but felt like one in the context of what it represented: 6 weeks of hard, honest work completed and accounted for. Maggie received the same as every other drover because Frank had insisted on this from the beginning, her wages set at the standard rate without any adjustment upward or downward for the fact of her being a woman. When Harold Tully found her afterward and told her that her position was permanent, that any drive the rocking T ran had a place for her if she wanted it, Maggie was quiet for a moment and then said, "Thank you, Mr. Tully. I would like that very much." "Frank says you're the best hand he's had in 3 years, Tully said. "He said as much to the whole outfit," Maggie said, and something in her voice when she said it made Harold Tully hide a smile in his collar. Abilene itself, for a day and a half, was everything that the end of a long drive was supposed to be. The cowboys dispersed into the city's establishments with the energy of men who had earned leisure and were determined to make full use of it. Amos Dupree declared that he was eating a meal that someone else had cooked if it was the last thing he ever did, and disappeared into the better of Abilene's 2 restaurants. Pete Garfield found a card game and proceeded to demonstrate considerably less aptitude for poker than Maggie had shown, which was a recurring feature of his life. Hector Vega wrote a long letter home. Frank found Maggie in the early evening, standing at the edge of one of Abilene's wider streets, watching the city with the particular observant quiet that was one of the things he had come to love about her. He stood beside her, and they watched together for a while, the city doing its loud, busy, end-of-drive things around them. "What do you do next?" he asked, though he already had a version of the answer in mind that he was working up the courage to present as a question. "Go back," Maggie said. "Tully said there's another drive in August. That gives me time to find somewhere to stay in the interim." She paused. "I've been thinking about Laramie. There's nothing there for me now exactly, but it's what I know." "There's something in Laramie I'd like to show you," Frank said, "if you're willing to travel back that way." She looked at him. "What would that be?" "My place," he said. "I've got 40 acres outside of Laramie, small house, decent land. I've been meaning to do more with it than use it as somewhere to leave my gear between drives." He paused, and the careful way he was choosing his words was itself a kind of declaration. "I've been thinking about what I want it to be, whether it could be more than that." Maggie was very still in the way that she was still when she was paying her deepest attention to something. "Frank," she said, "are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" "I don't know yet exactly what I'm asking," he said, which was honest. "I know I'm asking you to come and see it. I know I'm asking for whatever time comes after this drive. I know," he said, and this part was harder and more important than the rest, "I know that I don't want to go back to Laramie and have you somewhere else. I know that clearly." "You're not a man who says things he doesn't mean," Maggie said. "No," he agreed. "Then I'll come and see it," she said. They rode back to Laramie together, which took a week, the two of them and their horses crossing the same country the drive had passed through in the other direction, but at a different pace, the pace of two people who are not managing 1,500 cattle and 14 cowboys, who have time to stop when they want to and talk without being called away and look at things without needing to calculate their professional significance. It was perhaps the finest week either of them had ever spent, though neither of them said so in those terms, because that would have been getting slightly ahead of things. They rode through long days and made camps in the evening, and cooked over their own fire and talked about everything under the sky. And the sky over that country was enormous, full of all the weather and light and space that had brought Frank Bancroft out of Missouri 20 years before and brought Maggie Brooks through the winter after her father died, and out the other side into the largest possible version of her own life. When they reached the 40 acres outside of Laramie on a cool June evening, the light going golden over the land, Frank showed her the house, which was small and solid, and had been built by someone who understood prairie winters, and the land, which was good grass with a creek through the lower quarter, and the barn, which was better than the house, the way barns often were on properties owned by men who understood horses. Maggie stood in the yard and looked at all of it, and then she looked at Frank, who was watching her with the careful attention of a man waiting for a verdict that matters enormously. "It needs a garden," she said. "South side of the house where the light is long in the afternoon." "I don't know anything about gardens," Frank said. "I do," she said. The silence that followed was full. "Maggie," Frank said, and the way he said her name was different from all the previous times, weighted and deliberate and utterly serious. "I am 30 years old, and I have been trying to figure out for the last 6 weeks how to say something that I do not have a lot of experience saying, and the truth is I think the direct approach is the only one that suits either of us." "I believe that is correct," she said. "I love you," he said. "I think I have been falling in love with you since the first morning on the drive, and I have been watching you work and watching you be exactly who you are, and I love you, and I want to know if you would be willing to make this place something with me, something permanent." Maggie Brooks looked at Frank Bancroft, this steady, serious, remarkable man who had defended her where everyone could hear, and told the truth where it counted, and held her hand in the dark over a dying fire with the careful tenderness of someone who understood the weight of what he was holding, and she felt everything she had been feeling for 6 weeks resolve into the most uncomplicated certainty she had ever experienced. "I love you," she said. "I have been loving you since approximately that river crossing where you told Howell the truth, but possibly earlier." She paused. "Yes, I want to make this place something, with you." They were married in Laramie in July, in a ceremony that was brief and practical and attended by a small collection of people including Harold Tully, who cried in the dignified manner of old men who have earned the right to their emotions, Pete Garfield, who did not cry but came very close, Amos Dupree, who brought food that was significantly better than anything he had produced on the trail, and Davis Cole, who said good. When the ceremony was done, which from Davis was a full ovation, Hector Vega gave them a wedding gift of hand-tooled leather work that had taken him 3 weeks, and that Maggie hung in the barn where she would see it every day. The summer was good, and the August drive was better, because Maggie and Frank rode it together as trail boss and right flank drover and husband and wife, and the dynamic of the outfit was different in ways that were difficult to quantify but entirely real. Frank had always been good at his work. With Maggie riding his right flank, he was exceptional, because she was someone he could think out loud with, someone whose read of the cattle and the country he trusted completely, and that trust made him more effective in ways that compounded through every aspect of the drive. Tully noticed. Other cattle owners in Wyoming and Kansas began to notice. Within a year, Frank's reputation as a trail boss had grown to the point where he was turning down offers, because he was selective about whose cattle he drove and under what conditions, and because he had something to come home to that made the question of how long he was away a genuinely important one. The 40 acres outside of Laramie became something over the following year. The garden that Maggie had called for on the south side of the house was in by the following spring, and producing vegetables with the determination that everything Maggie put her hand to seemed to produce, as though the things she tended took her commitment as instruction. The house was expanded, not by hired men but by Frank and Maggie together on the days between drives, adding a room that was initially discussed as storage, and that both of them understood without saying so directly was for something else. That something else arrived in the spring of 1880, a boy born on a Tuesday morning in the room they had built, with the Laramie wind going loud outside the window, and Dr. Harmon from town in attendance and Frank sitting in the kitchen, in the particular tortured patience of a man who cannot manage this kind of weight by doing anything useful. They named him Chester, for Maggie's father. Frank held his son for the first time with the same careful deliberateness with which he held everything important, and looked at his face, the compact, furious, determined face of a newborn who had strong opinions about having arrived, and felt something that reorganized everything inside him into a new and permanent configuration. Maggie, watching Frank hold Chester from the bed where she was recovering with the matter-of-fact resilience that was entirely characteristic of her, said, "He has your jaw. He has your expression," Frank said. "And what expression is that? Like he is not going to be told what to do by anything or anyone," Frank said. Maggie smiled. "Good." Pete Garfield, who had stayed on with the rocking tea and was therefore nearby when the news came, arrived at the house with an inappropriate amount of whiskey and a completely appropriate amount of emotion, and declared himself the baby's unofficial uncle with a conviction that nobody disputed. Amos Dupree arrived the following week with food. Harold Tully wrote a letter from Cheyenne that was brief and warm, and enclosed a small amount of money for the baby's future that was characteristically generous and characteristically unannounced. Davis Cole sent a handmade toy horse carved from walnut wood, with a note that said only for Chester Brooks Bancroft. The use of both names together was, for Davis Cole, practically a speech. The brindle steer, which had been sold in Abilene along with the rest of the herd, and was therefore no longer anyone's professional problem, did not send anything but was occasionally referenced in the Bancroft household as the animal who had, in a roundabout way, been responsible for the occasion that had made everything clear. The years that followed were full years, full of work, which was the kind of life that suited both of them. Full of drives, because Frank continued his work and Maggie continued hers, adapting the rhythm of it to the rhythm of the family they were building, taking the drives that worked with that rhythm and declining the ones that didn't. They were not conventional, and they did not try to be, because they had both come from the trying to be conventional and had found it insufficient. They were themselves, which was its own sufficient thing. The injustices of the time did not go unnoticed from where they stood. When other women came to the territory looking for work, Maggie spoke for them where speaking was needed. When the men who owned the cattle and the land and the railroads pressed their advantages against the men who worked for them, Frank used his reputation to push back where pushing was possible. They could not change the world, but they were not the kind of people who stood quietly in front of things that were wrong simply because those things were established. That was not in either of their natures, and Chester grew up watching it, which was its own kind of education. Chester Bancroft grew with the same focused determination that characterized both his parents, taking to horses before he was 4 with the natural ease of someone who had been saturated in the presence and knowledge of horses since before he was born. By the time he was 6, he was riding the gentler animals in the string with Maggie alongside him, and Maggie taught him the same way her father had taught her, by sitting him on the quietest horse and telling him to watch, and by being there when watching gave way to doing. In the spring of 1882, a girl arrived. They named her Eliza, and she had Maggie's brown eyes and Frank's stubborn jaw, and a temperament that combined the best and most complex qualities of both, which meant she was delightful and never, under any circumstances, backing down. The house was expanded again, and the barn was improved, and the 40 acres became 60 when the adjacent parcel came available, and Frank bought it on the grounds that good land was worth having, and that Chester and Eliza would need something to build on. Harold Tully retired in 1883, and the rocking tee was sold to a younger man who had the good sense to keep Frank on as a contractor for his drives, and the good sense to keep Maggie in his thinking as the person whose read of a herd was worth more than anyone else's in the territory. Tully retired to a small house in Cheyenne and grew roses, which surprised everyone who knew him, and Frank visited him twice a year, and they sat on the porch and talked about cattle and the old days with the particular pleasure that old professionals take in reviewing work well done. Pete Garfield married a woman named Rosa from a ranching family near Laramie, and their family and the Bancroft family were wound together through every subsequent season in the way that the families of people who have worked and trusted each other become wound together. Davis Cole never married, but he was a regular presence at the Bancroft table, and Chester called him Uncle Davis with a confidence that Davis accepted without objection, which was the highest possible form of acceptance from him. Amos Dupree lived to 81, which was remarkable for a man who had spent 40 years breathing campfire smoke, and he insisted that it was because he had eaten his own cooking and knew exactly what was in it. He died in the winter of 1895 in a bed with a proper mattress, which he said was an improvement he had never taken for granted, and the Bancrofts attended his funeral with the full weight of genuine grief and genuine gratitude for everything he had been on that first drive and every drive after. Frank and Maggie celebrated their 5th anniversary on a June evening in 1883, sitting on the porch of the house that was no longer small, with Chester running in the yard and Eliza asleep inside, and the Laramie sky doing its endless work overhead. Frank had made a reasonable attempt at cooking dinner, which was an ongoing project of his that produced interesting results with occasional moments of genuine success, and they ate it on the porch and afterward sat with their coffee in the long northern evening light. "Do you think about that first morning?" Maggie asked. "At the rocking tee?" "I think about it a great deal," Frank said. "I think about what I thought of you before I had any right to think anything." "What did you think?" "I thought you were going to be a problem," he said. Maggie laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that he had been listening to for 5 years and that still had the same effect on him that it had had the first time she aimed it at him across a poker game by firelight. "You were right," she said. "The best kind of problem," he said. She leaned against him on the porch bench, her shoulder against his, her head tipping slightly toward him with the comfortable ease of someone who had found exactly the right place and had the sense to recognize it. He put his arm around her, and they sat in the evening light and watched their son chase something energetically through the yard, and listened to the sound of the wind in the grass on the lower quarter and the creek running through it. And the world was entirely, solidly, beautifully present around them. "Best hand on the drive," Frank said quietly, and the words had 20 years of context behind them now, all the drives and the seasons and the work and the children and the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life built together. "You said so where everyone could hear," Maggie said, equally quietly. "I meant every word," he said. She turned her face up toward his, and he kissed her with the careful, deliberate warmth of a man who understood what he had been given and intended to honor it. And the Laramie sky above them was enormous and full of summer light, and the evening went on for a long time. Chester came running up to the porch with something he had found in the grass, a hawk feather, broad and beautifully marked, and he held it up for his parents to see with the complete conviction of a 6-year-old that this was among the finest things ever discovered in the history of the world. "Can I keep it?" he demanded. "Yes," Frank and Maggie said together. Chester disappeared back into the yard, satisfied, and they heard him telling the feather about his plans for it, which involved considerable imagination. Eliza woke inside and made her opinion of having woken known in the clear, decisive way that was her primary mode of communication, and Maggie went to get her and came back to the porch with her daughter on her hip. And Eliza looked at the evening light over the land with the focused, considering expression of someone who was already figuring out how everything worked and intended to have something to say about it. Frank watched his wife and his daughter in the evening light, and he thought about the morning in the yard at the rocking tee when a woman on a roan mare had ridden in and checked her own cinch, and proved in the first 20 minutes that she was better than he had expected, and about everything that had followed from that morning: the long trail, the work, the nights by the fire, the hand held over dying embers, the words said where everyone could hear, and the words said only in the dark, and the years and the life. The full, real, ongoing, beautiful life. He thought about all of it, and he held the thought the way you hold something precious, with both hands and the full attention of everything you are. Then Eliza reached out with one small hand and grabbed his coffee cup and attempted to assert authority over it, and he rescued the coffee, and the moment collapsed into the ordinary lovely chaos of evening with small children, and that was entirely, completely right. The land was good. The work was good. The sky above Wyoming was as big as it had always been. And at the end of every day there was this: the woman who had been the only woman on the cattle drive and the best hand on it, sitting on the porch of the home they had built together, watching the stars come out over the land they owned and the children they had made, her hand in his, the night coming on soft and full, everything resolved, everything whole, everything exactly as it should be.